The federal government didn't announce this shift, it just flipped the switch. You were told this was about the border, but at the exact moment that message went out, the machinery moved inward. Agencies that had never touched immigration were reassigned. A national emergency was declared. Homeland Security task forces were ordered into all 50 states, not border states, all of them. Here's the contradiction. While officials kept talking about enforcement at the border, the structure they built treats the entire country like one. When every state becomes a border zone, immigration enforcement stops being a location-based policy and starts becoming an ambient condition of daily life. And this matters to you for a simple reason. When federal power is reorganized at this scale, it doesn't ask permission from ordinary people. It just changes the environment you live in. Who gets stopped, who gets tracked, who gets questioned, and who doesn't. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This wasn't built as a temporary response. The design tells a different story, because once you see how deep this reorganization goes, it becomes clear this wasn't about solving a problem, it was about building a system. What actually triggered this shift wasn't a single raid or a single announcement. It was a structural move that most people missed. In July 2025, the administration signed something called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. On paper, it looked like funding. In reality, it rewired priorities. The bill injected $170 billion directly into enforcement. Not courts, not processing, enforcement. At the same time, immigration case backlogs climbed toward 3.8 million, but the number of judges was capped. That detail matters because it tells you what the system is optimized to do. Speed out, not hear out. This wasn't framed as a temporary surge. The money was spread across detention, walls, and operations designed to last for years. $45 billion for detention camps, $46 billion for physical barriers, infrastructure that doesn't disappear when headlines change. Notice the pattern. When a government expects a short-term problem, it builds flexibility. When it expects permanence, it builds concrete. So here's the real question. If this was never about fixing the backlog, what was it designed to enable next? Here's the claim that changes how this all looks. This system only works if enforcement becomes everyone's job. And that's exactly what happened. Internal personnel data shows that 23% of the FBI's entire agent pool was reassigned to immigration enforcement. In major field offices, that number climbed toward 50%. Agents trained to track spies, terrorists, and organized crime were redirected to visa overstays and deportation operations. This wasn't a side task, it was a mission shift. The Bureau of Prisons was folded in. The U.S. Marshals were pulled in. Even the ATF was brought into the pipeline. Badges that once had clear lanes were suddenly blended into one enforcement stream. On paper, this was called coordination. In practice, it meant the wall between national security and civil immigration enforcement quietly collapsed. Notice what's missing here. There was no corresponding announcement about reducing other threats, no declaration that terrorism had vanished, no statement that violent crime no longer required attention. The resources didn't multiply, they were reassigned. And once that door opened, the escalation didn't stay domestic, because the next phase of this system didn't just reorganize power inside the US, it projected it outward. Once that redirection began, the pace accelerated fast. What started as reassignment turned into normalization. Federal law enforcement agencies that once operated in parallel were now operating as one. Immigration enforcement stopped being a specialty and became a default setting. There's a historical echo here, and it's uncomfortable. When governments blur missions during emergencies, the blur rarely snaps back. Temporary authorities have a way of becoming permanent habits. What was once justified as exceptional becomes routine, then expected. You can see it in the language. Officials stopped describing these actions as extraordinary measures. They started describing them as baseline operations. Task forces embedded across states, shared databases, joint operations. The idea that immigration enforcement should be limited or contained quietly disappeared. This is where the story flips. When something that should raise alarms becomes boring, that's when systems lock in. The absence of protest isn't proof of safety, it's proof of normalization. And while this new enforcement posture settled in at home, something else happened abroad. The same logic of pressure and leverage was exported, reshaping how the US dealt with the rest of the world. The next layer is where the contradictions get harder to ignore. Publicly, officials talked about fairness and security. Operationally, the actions told a different story. The administration announced an indefinite freeze on visa processing for 75 countries. Not a pause, a freeze. Countries spanning from Brazil to Russia were suddenly shut out. The criteria weren't framed around crimes or threats, they were framed around risk profiles, age, health, finances, the likelihood of becoming a so-called public charge. Here's the detail that changes everything. This wasn't case by case, it was categorical. Entire populations were filtered out before an application could even be heard. Billions of people effectively lost access overnight. Notice what wasn't denied. There was no claim this was temporary, no timeline for review, no clear path back in. The door wasn't slowed, it was locked. At the same time, officials continued to describe the United States as open to legal immigration. But openness without access is just branding. When the gate is closed by default, the message and the mechanism no longer match. And once access is cut at that scale, enforcement pressure doesn't stay abstract. It has to land somewhere. Once those doors closed, pressure didn't disappear. It concentrated, and the way it was released tells you what kind of system this had become. Foreign governments were suddenly put on notice. Accept US deportees or face consequences. Reports described threats that went far beyond diplomacy. Retaking the Panama Canal, cutting off all diplomatic visas, travel bans imposed on countries like Sierra Leone and Niger simply for refusing to cooperate. This wasn't negotiation. It was leverage applied at speed. The message was simple and blunt. Become a holding zone for people the US no longer wants, or lose access, status, and economic stability. Then the system moved even faster. The government activated a rarely used doctrine allowing third-country deportations. Migrants were flown to places they had never lived, never visited, and had no legal ties to. Rwanda, South Sudan, Panama. Here's the line that should stop you cold. Officials acknowledge that once these flights land, the US often has no idea what happens next. At this point, the story stops being abstract and starts hitting real lives in real time. Inside the US, enforcement shifted into a daily grind. Homeland Security advisor Stephen Miller confirmed a target number: 3,000 arrests per day, not per month, per day. That number mattered more than context, more than threat level, more than discretion. Leadership was reshuffled to enforce it. ICE directors who failed to meet the numbers were removed. They were replaced with officials known for aggressive tactics. The signal inside the agency was clear: miss the quota, lose your job. And when enforcement becomes a numbers game, the net widens automatically. Workplaces, neighborhoods, routine stops, raids stop being surgical and start becoming sweeps. If you live in a city, this doesn't stay theoretical. It changes how safe a factory feels, how quiet a street feels, how fast a situation can escalate when heavily armed agents are under pressure to produce results. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because once quotas drive behavior, the system stops asking who should be targeted. It only asks how fast. Here's the uncomfortable truth beneath all of this. Systems like this don't run on ideology. They run on incentives. Once massive funding is locked in, agencies are rewarded for activity, not outcomes. Arrests are measurable. Speed is measurable. Removal numbers are measurable. Justice, restraint, and long-term stability are not. So the system drifts toward what can be counted, fear becomes leverage, emergency language becomes routine, inter-agency blending reduces accountability because responsibility is shared and therefore owned by no one. When everyone is involved, no one is clearly in charge. This is why spectacle matters. Raids at factories, highly visible arrests, publicized removals. They signal momentum upward and compliance downward. The machine doesn't need universal approval. It only needs enough silence to keep operating. Here's why that detail changes everything. Once a system is optimized for motion, stopping it looks like failure, slowing it looks like weakness, even questioning it looks like sabotage. So the system keeps moving not because it's proven effective, but because it's proven durable. And that raises the next question. Where does this trajectory actually lead from here? From here, the path splits, but neither direction is clean. One possibility is acceleration. The funding is already secured. The agencies are already blended. The legal frameworks are already stretched. That means expansion doesn't require a new decision, just continuation. More countries added to freezes, more third country transfers, more internal enforcement pressure as quotas become normalized. Momentum carries it forward on autopilot. The other path looks quieter, but it's not necessarily safer. Legal challenges pile up, diplomatic relationships strain, economic disruptions surface as labor shortages and alliance damage become harder to ignore. In response, the system doesn't fully retreat. It adjusts. It becomes more selective, more automated, more invisible. Notice what both paths share. There is no obvious off-ramp. The infrastructure is already built. The incentives are already aligned. Whatever comes next won't start from zero. It will start from here. And that means the next move isn't hypothetical. It's already forming, just out of frame. Here's the insight that ties all of this together. What you're watching isn't a crackdown. It's a conversion. Immigration enforcement didn't just get tougher. It got reclassified as a permanent security function. Once that happens, scale becomes normal, exceptions become tools, and oversight becomes friction. This is why so many of these changes felt sudden but weren't. The funding locked it in, the agency blending operationalized it, the emergency language justified it. By the time most people noticed, the system was already running. And here's the part worth sitting with. Systems built this way don't need constant approval. They only need to keep moving faster than accountability can catch up. If you want to understand what comes next, you won't find it in press releases. You'll find it in the next quiet expansion, the next rule adjustment, the next line that barely makes the news. Follow for the next layer of this story.